this panel discussion, we will be focusing on the topic, the South China Sea and the rules-based international order. Joining our panel today are Professor Pankaj K Jha, Professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs and Director of Center for Security Studies, OP Jindal University, and Executive Director of the think tank CESCUBE. Mr. Lucio Blanco Pitlo III, Research Fellow at the Asia-Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation, and member of the Board of Directors, Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. And finally, Ms. Surbi Mudgil, Research Associate at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Chairing the discussion this afternoon is Commodore Abhay Kumar Singh, an Indian Navy veteran who is currently a research fellow at the Military Affairs Center in the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. Participants are requested to remain muted throughout the event. To post questions during the event, you may send in your queries or comments via the chat box or use the raise hand option during the Q&A. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nair, and thank you very much, Ambassador Kanta, for inviting me to moderate this discussion. This discussion on South China Sea and its implication for rule-based order is topical, and I fully agree with that what was given in the conference proceedings, that China's sweeping claims of sovereignty over extensive area of South China Sea and non-adherence to UNCLOS has far-reaching implications beyond this region. In my view, one of the worrisome implications of South China Sea dispute has been the waning confidence in rule-based order, which is arguably seen most clearly in the current dispute over interpretation of the rules and the principles enshrined in UNCLOS. While the legitimacy of the rules themselves are not being questioned, the rule-based order is being undermined by the selective and motivated interpretation of the rules and norms, along with the calling in question the authority of widely accepted consensual application and interpretation of rule and norms, which is referred legally as a opinio juris. China's recalcitrant behavior in the South China Sea and also in the East China Sea has been a major causative factor of this waning confidence in rule-based order. While China has refrained from launching a large-scale aggression or all-out military operation, China has used a wide spectrum of assertive tools of gray zone strategy to progressively shift the status quo in its favor. The issue, however, is not that China flagrantly violates international law. It is that it does so while simultaneously creating a veneer of legal legitimacy of its position. While China has not been specific about the extent of its claims, it uses ambiguous 9-dash line to lay claims over more than 90% of South China Sea, even though the concept of historical claims lacks a clear basis in the international law, as it has been brought out by the ruling of arbitration tribunal. Rather than solely relying on the vague claim of historical rights, which tribunal had dismissed, Beijing subsequently has reframed the South China Sea claims based on using phraseology and terms of UNCLOS. One of the noticeable shifts in China's sovereignty claims in South China Sea has been renewed emphasis on a new legal theory of Sha or Foresha, which is based on the maritime entitlement extending from 4 island groups in South China Sea: Dongsa, Jisa, Nansa, and Jongsa. This apparent emphasis on the 9-dash line and renewed assertion of based on Foresha claims may have resulted from realization that 9-dash line has become too much of a diplomatic liability due to sui generis nature of this claim. China may have concluded that the adoption and reinterpretation of existing UNCLOS rules better suits its interest. Since the legal doctrine of straight baselines has a broader application in maritime jurisdiction claim of various countries, it could be easier to get acquiescence from jurists and government on rather innovative approach of Foresha rather than the finding support of the ambiguous 9-dash line. Now, this Foresha claim fundamentally relates to making the island, that's partly Paracels, and other island group as an archipelagic nature, and drawing a baseline from the outlying islands, and thereafter maritime zones, mapping the maritime zones from these baselines upward, even though China is not a archipelagic country. The Chinese Society of International Law has argued that these island groups are fully qualified as a archipelago. The interconnecting water within the archipelago are under the Chinese sovereignty. While the China's assertive unilateralism is indeed a serious challenge, but we must remember that South China Sea dispute could be termed as a wicked problem. Given the complex nature of competing claims and counterclaims are multiple claimants. Wicked claims are highly complex issues in terms of policy formulation and are highly resistant to solution since they involve many causative factors and there are high levels of disagreement about the nature of a problem and the best way to handle them. The effective solution lies in a change in the behavior and mindset of stakeholders. Hopefully, the South China Sea still awaits such a change, and whether such a change are expected or likely to happen. We have our three speakers to deliberate on these issues, and I invite Professor Pankaj Jha first. Professor Jha, floor is yours.
Thank you. It's afternoon, a very good afternoon to each and all. And I hope my latest book, which is edited one, it's not a single author one, which talks about South China Sea contesting narratives and global realities. You know, it came out in 2022 itself. I wrote two of the chapters and conclusion. One of the chapters that I wrote was about China's historical narrative and inherent discrepancies. Yes, of course, that chapter is controversial because I reproduced few of the maps, which clearly shows that in terms of narrative, China has faltered both in terms of building the historical narratives and joining it through convincing, map and historical data, which was missing in most of the cases. Now, when you look into these South China Sea, there are basically three maritime jurisdictional disputes in South China Sea, which exist comprising of three diverse dimensions: island sovereignty disputes, delimitation disputes on exclusive economic zones and continental shelf, and freedom of navigation versus the extent of jurisdiction over territorial waters, international straits, archipelagic waters, and exclusive economic zones, which again has been talked about. Now, when you look into China's claim on South China Sea's Daesh line is perceived as critical for the safety of sea lanes, as well as it infringes on the right of other littoral nations to claim commercial rights on fisheries, as well as exploration of oil and gas. Now, when you look into this claim of the 9-dash line or the U-shaped line, or as many people in Singapore and other places say it's a cow's tongue, in enclosing its enclaimed islands and surrounding waters has given rise to a number of objections and protests on the part of neighboring states of the Spratly Islands. When you look into this, arguments which have been given, and one of the arguments which came about in 13th of April 1993, when the 1982 UN Convention of the Law on Seas was about to enter into the force, the Executive Yuan of the Republic of China adopted policy guidelines for the South China Sea, which answered the above questions with regard to this maritime boundary line of the South China Sea. And it stated, and I quote, "In terms of history, geography, international law, and facts, the Nansha Islands, Shisha Islands, Chongsha Islands, and Tungsha Islands are part of the inherent territory of the Republic of China. The sovereignty over those islands belong to the Republic of China, and the South China Sea area within the historic waters limit is the maritime area under the jurisdiction of the Republic of China, where the Republic of China possesses all rights and interests," unquote. Now, when you look into the Chinese claimed 9-11, which was submitted to the UN on May 7th, 2009, and it talks about, absolute right, adjoining water, and also jurisdiction over relevant water, and as well as the subsurface area of the sea. There are problems, and I will take these primarily from the point of view of history, and this is where my core argument really builds on. When you look into the historical narratives which have been proposed by China and the flaws, and this book which I edited, it has got certain maps which have been collected from various places, including US libraries in Japan and all of those places. And it shows that when you look into the historical past, China has never been able to build that, look, South China Sea is a part of the sovereign territory of China, And this is where the major flaw in its historical argument is over. When you look into official and unofficial map released from China from 1136 during the Song dynasty, as well as during the regime of the Qing dynasty in 1912, show that the southernmost latitude of China has always been Hainan Island. And in comparison, the on official and unofficial maps of both Vietnam and even parts of Philippines say that the Paracel Islands and large part of Spratlys belong to Vietnam and Philippines. With regard to this boundaries issues and which have been talked about, China's claim on the islands in 2013 released new map which added 1 dash to the make it 10 dash line closer to the eastern shore of Taiwan. In administrative maps on Hainan and Guangzhou, which I have reproduced in the book itself, China claimed that the 10 lines has been its sovereign maritime boundaries adjoining its island territories, but it fails to explain the legal basis without giving any geographic coordinates for those dashes. And this is where the major debate is with the Southeast Asian countries, which are also claiming to it. Now, and it has been really talking about consuming, it has been asking for reclamation of reef located in South China Sea, which include Fairy Cross Reef, Gaven Reef, Johnson South Reef, Yosobic Reef, and 3 more reefs which are located in close proximity. However, when you look into the Chinese texts which have been citing Chinese claims on South China Sea, have alluded to partisan Chinese sources which have at times missed the context as well as appropriate historical account to buttress their claims related to Spratlys and Paracel Islands. If I remember right, one of the speeches which have been made by Justice Carpio way back in ICW, which says they have built certain historical narratives which says on a land of near about 6 square feet, they said there used to exist a pagoda when most of the reefs used to lie submerged on water at one point of time. So these kinds of narratives which are not very convincing is one major aspect which should be seen from that point of view. One of the scholars, Bill Hayton, has alluded that these narratives related to Chinese claim on South China Sea have been in phases, such as in 1909, 1928, and 1933. Few narratives have also been proposed in the post-Second World War era. It has been argued that the ideas related to Chinese claims have at many times manifested because of domestic political compulsions and the crisis because of domestic aspirations with regard to China's emerging as a major power. In the case of first of the few writers which have stated that the appearance of this 9 dash line came in December 1914. But the 9 dash line, which was earlier 11 dash line, first appeared in the official narratives of China, which was earlier known as Republic of China in 1946, which everybody knows. But the document was known as the map of the location of the islands in South China Sea. Later in 1949, the Republic of China, which replaced People's Republic of China, which replaced Republic of China, came out with official maps which claimed 11 dash lines starting from Hainan and ending closer to Taiwan. The 11 dash line also has been modified. Few of these lines have been dropped. But when you look into the September 1958, China has declared the 12 nautical miles territorial sea, taking into cognizance the straight baselines which are subsequently contested by Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and even Indonesia. This outline of 12 nautical miles was applicable to all the island territories under full control of PRC, even those islands which were under the control of Taiwan. However, Chinese claims over Dongsha, Xisha, Nansha, and Zhongsha were always disputed. Chinese pronouncements were made on the basis of law of the sea, which was valid in 1958, on the basis that high seas may exist, and therefore China has made provisions about it in this case. Apart from the 4 groups of islands, with the exception of Zhongsha, China has clearly prescribed under the law of the territorial sea and the contiguous zone outlined in the 25th February 1992 document that the territorial land of China includes mainland and offshore islands, which includes Taiwan and the various affiliated islands. China has very smartly proposed that fact that the baselines of the territorial sea were submitted before UN while the UNCLOS was not ratified should be seen as a basis. The proposal from China was that the best baselines provision is applicable with regard to mainland China and the Shisha Islands, and under the state baselines, but the same provision that it's not applicable with regard to other islands. China has always tried to express its rights under the historical rights and historical waters. Now, very lately, it has been found that Taiwan and China have sought reconciliation through the 3 No's policy, which was supported in Ma Ying-jeou administration. Few of the narratives have germinated after July 1993 as a result of French occupation of 6 Spratly Islands And in that narrative, it is stated that French found very few fishermen surviving on that islands. In fact, one of the first claims that China has stated in its historical analysis when there was a crisis related to Japanese guano mining operation on the island of Patas. The Chinese lost territory to Japan way back during 1894 to 1895. Signing of Japanese war agreement angered Chinese people, and their grievance was with regard to failure of the Qing government for failing to register Japanese aggression and protect the citizens. So subsequently, it has really drawn from different scattered narratives, be it the case of Admiral Zheng He, visit to Cham civilization in central Vietnam, and Kingdom has wrongly referred to it as Philippine Islands. Therefore, the narratives related to visit of Zheng to Philippines has been proven wrong. Therefore, she has claimed that Admiral Zheng has visited Manila Bay along with Visayas and Sulu Seas is the wrong interpretation of history and a concocted thesis. While it is internationally acknowledged that the Admiral Zheng He has visited Africa and Arabia, but there is no mention of its visit to Philippines. And in the 1947 Constitution of Republic of China, it is clearly mentioned that Hainan was the country's southernmost part. So how they are really driving from the Chinese, from Taiwanese legacy with regard to South China Sea is for anybody to consider it. When you look into the maps which have been reproduced, both from the Japanese scholars or as well as few of the books which are kept in University of Berkeley, it clearly shows that Vietnam has provided a much credible documentation from the period between 1902 and the developments during the Second World War, while Taiwan is not recognized because of One China principles in 1949, and as it is not a signatory of the Law of the Seas Convention. So therefore, all claims made by Taiwan under the Republic of China has been seen as null and void, and China has also not accepted these provisions which have been recognized as the rightful heir to the Taiwan. The bigger debate is that whether these islands can sustain human habitations, cannot sustain human habitation, and therefore cannot have exclusive economic zones. Chinese sovereignty related to sovereignty over Chinese claims related to sovereignty over Scarborough Reef and adjoining areas. If you look into it, and even the Paracel Islands, Chinese reclamation exercises on Duncan Islands, which China has annexed from Vietnam in 1974, when Vietnam was undertaking military operations against the US forces for liberating southern Vietnam, shows that the fact that its annexation is illegal and should be considered as a disputed territory. So if one looks into the history of South China Sea, it was in 1914 that first private map of South China Sea appeared. The same map was reproduced in 1920s and early 1930s, which contained a line extending from Pratas Reef to the Paracel Islands. In 1933, China has changed its position when France occupied 9 of the Spratly Islands, and subsequently in protest, China released a U-shaped line. So that is the history of how U-shaped line really came into being. Subsequently, in 1935, under a geographical survey conducted by China, it identified 132 names for these islets and islands and rock elevations, which was published by the Chinese government in that year. In September 1937, Japan military survey of the islands brought to the control of the Paracel Islands in 1938. In June 1945, the Kuomintang government in China makes claim of these islands and had called for their return by April 1948. So when you look into these history which has been really proposed and which is being seen as a foundation of Chinese claim, it shows that there has been certain narratives which has been, pick and choose from certain maps and certain historical records, and they have been trying to make connections to this fill in the blanks proposition that they want to really bring about. But when you look into the historical accounts of countries like Philippines and Vietnam, they have much more concrete proposals which says that South China Sea, Spratly Islands, particularly not all of Spratly Islands, but parts of it and few parts of Paracel Islands were under the occupation of these countries. Primarily fishermen have been visiting these places. When you look into these accounts which have been given by China, particularly with regard to their maps and all those things, and it is interesting, and I will cite few of the maps that I also cited in my book. And one of the maps which is there and which talks about it is 1850 map, 1850 map, which is from one of the Chinese scholars itself, which doesn't make any mention of South China Sea as one of the sovereign areas of China. It only ends at Hainan Island, and this map is reproduced in my book as well, with permission from Then again, when you look into the one of the maps which was reproduced in 1905, it doesn't make any mention of the South China Sea. Another map which was produced by Japanese in 1907, it again doesn't really talks about South China Sea as a sovereign part of China or Chinese territory as such. So when you look into and collate all the maps, you will be able to produce a counter narrative, which I find most of the Chinese scholars will not be able to counter it, because it is just reproduced in my book, and it clearly showcases that South China Sea is a more of a geopolitical ambition which have been proposed by China and has been forced upon South China Sea other claimant states, including Taiwan. One more important aspect is that when you look into Chinese academic circles and you visit many of them, they said we have all kinds of histories. They show you all kinds of fishermen pictures, the pottery and all those things. They said these potteries have been recovered from those Spratly Islands and Paracel Island, given the fact that none of these islands were able to support human habitation. So in all, you can say that even institutions like Institute for South China Sea and related, they have created one institute in Hainan Islands which talks about the Institute for South China Sea. They have created narratives, and one of the most important things, and which many people will not be really looking into it, is that when you look into their maps, the India and the Kashmir has been undivided, and it doesn't show the way that they show nowadays our Kashmir. So their museum also acknowledges that Kashmir, the whole of Kashmir was a part of India, and they had no way that they could have claimed Eastern Ladakh as the part of their territory. All in all, I can say the historical narrative which have been proposed by China is dubious and needs certain gaps, and there are flaws in the narrative. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for very comprehensive overview of Chinese historical narrative and its limitation in justifying its case. Survi, do we have
yes,
Lucio?
Yes, Chair. Professor Lucio has joined us.
Okay. So I think it will be wonderful if Dr. Lucio Blanco Piclo could unmute himself and make it himself available. We will be very eagerly, we are waiting to listen to his perspective, and particularly from the Philippine side, that which way wind is blowing in the South China Sea.
Thank you, Chair, Commodore Singh. Thank you, Dr. Surbi, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to speak alongside great luminaries from India on this issue of the South China Sea. Good afternoon, Dr. Jha. And so for this afternoon, allow me to share my screen. Okay, can you guys see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
All right.
We can see.
All right, thank you, sir. So my presentation, my short talk this afternoon, I'll be touching on responses of South China Sea littoral states, in particular from the Philippines, because I'm from the country, and I'll touch on both the security and diplomatic approaches. So as a short background, I think the previous speakers have already touched on this. The nature of the South China Sea as a multi-party dispute. 6 claimants, if we will include Taiwan. But among all the claimants, of course, China has the most extensive maritime claims and also holds the largest real estate property. After establishing artificial island bases there from 2013 to around 2015. Which of course we know eventually became highly militarized, and it also has the greatest military wherewithal among the claimants. China is both a challenge and an opportunity for Southeast Asia, and for insular or maritime Southeast Asia, this challenge is most manifest in the South China Sea. The economic interdependence and security concerns gave way to a strategy that combines engagement and at the same time pushback. So China has been ASEAN's largest trade partner since 2009. But in 2019, ASEAN also became China's largest trade partner. And the volume of trade between these two have been growing by leaps and bounds over the years. And there's expectation that because of the sour relations between the US and China, and between China and the West in general, especially with the ongoing Ukraine war and China's attitudes towards it, um, it's expected that the investments from China going to US and Western Europe, as well as trade, will be affected. And it's possible that trade and investment flows may be redirected to countries that are considered more friendly. And Southeast Asia may be an area where that can take place. So I'm going to touch on three responses by the Philippines in particular, but this also has resonance with the approaches taken by our fellow Southeast Asian neighbors in relation to Chinese activities in the South China Sea. So the first one is the legal approach, the second is the diplomatic, and the third one is the security. So in terms of the legal approach, the Philippines, of course, uh, took both domestic and international legal actions to assert its sovereignty and jurisdiction on what we call as the West Philippine Sea, or the part of the South China Sea that corresponds to our exclusive economic zone in our continental shelf. So domestically, we have passed a maritime zones bill that defines our maritime zones in the contested waters. So it was already passed by our lower house of Congress. We have a bicameral legislature. So it already passed the first stage. It's now with the upper house as of December of last year. And of course, we have some elections. We have elections coming in about a month from now. And I think the next administration will tackle this pending bill as one of the key priorities for the next administration, regardless of who wins. Internationally, of course, we see law as a great equalizer to level the playing field symmetrically. Of course, the Philippines and for that matter, all other Southeast Asian claimant states relative to China, the disparity is huge, influence-wise, economic-wise, militarily-wise. So the Philippines saw it fit to resort to international law to try to level this asymmetry between us and China. So in 2013, after months of trying to handle a tense standoff in Scarborough Shoal, one of the contested features of the South China Sea, we initiated arbitration against China in 2013, and that is under Annex 7, Special Tribunal of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which was tried in The Hague. We received a favorable ruling 3 years after, and of course, we know China's reaction towards that ruling. But just the same, our leadership, the current administration of President Duterte, despite fostering friendly relations with China, had asserted that landmark or arbitral award in both domestic and international venues. In his first inaugural State of the Nation address in 2016, he cited that historic ruling, and no less than the 75th and the 76th UN General Assemblies were platforms also used by President Duterte to raise the importance of the award as being part of the law, and that no effort to diminish it will succeed. In ASEAN gatherings and also in the discussions between ASEAN and China, President Duterte also raised this arbitration award. And of course, the country, the Philippines, also welcomes the increasing number of countries that are endorsing or providing support to the 2016 arbitral award. Diplomatically, we have filed over 200 diplomatic protests since 2016, over Chinese activities in the South China Sea. So this figure is as of December of last year. At the same time, while we protest, while we demand China to remove their ships in the South China Sea, and as we demand actions for activities being done by China, including the presence of state-backed maritime militias, we also open doors for engagement. And this is where mutual, reciprocal high-level visits happens. We have also established a consultative mechanism, bilateral channel, high level between the Philippines and China in 2016 during the state visit of President Duterte to Beijing. And this mechanism had already met 6 times, the most recent of which was May of last year. We have also signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, to establish a joint Coast Guard committee, which already met 3 times. The most recent was 2020. And during that meeting, the first Chinese Coast Guard vessel ship also paid a visit to the Philippines. And this MOU on Joint Coast Guard Committee is part of that Coast Guard diplomacy, part of that effort to build confidence between the maritime law enforcement agencies of both sides. And of course, we recognize that as China had already built massive artificial island bases in that contested maritime space, they will be able to sustain longer and more frequent patrols in the South China Sea. So therefore, the risk of incidents between our ships, our fishermen, our white and gray ships, and their ships is bound to increase. So we have to find ways to try to de-escalate the situation if ever they occur, and as much as possible prevent them from happening altogether. Although we know that's difficult. We have also signed an MOU on oil and gas cooperation, try to have an open mind in terms of practical interim measures to try to pursue cooperation for extracting and developing oil and gas resources in the South China Sea. And in relation to that, the Philippines in 2020 have lifted the moratorium. So since we filed arbitration against China in 2013, we have suspended all upstream work, all exploration work in the South China Sea for oil and gas. But in 2020, we lifted it, and we're thinking that this vehicle for joint oil and gas development could provide the avenue for both sides to set aside disputes and pursue practical cooperation without infringing on the sovereignty of either side. In terms of high-level visits, President Duterte already made 5 trips to China. His first Secretary of Foreign Affairs already made 4 trips. I'm sorry, the first Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Cayetano, made 4 trips. And the second Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Routledge, already made 7 trips. And the most recent of that trip was last April 3 in Tunsi in Anhui province. And we have also begun to take part in security dialogues initiated by Beijing, notably the Xiangshan Forum. We have dispatched our defense undersecretary in 2018 to join that conversation. In return, China had also made trips, official high-level visits to the Philippines. President Xi made a stop in 2018, Vice Premier Wang Yang, and of course the State Councilor for Mr. Wang Yi already made 3 trips to China. The most recent high-level conversation between both leaders occurred last week, April 8. This was done virtually. Still with the diplomatic initiative, we have also resumed a joint oceanographic and marine scientific research expedition with Vietnam in November of last year. And of course, I think this is a very important development because we had this in the 1990s and early 2000s, but somewhere along the way during the leadership transition, this was discontinued. And so this being resumed at this time, of course, signals that the Philippines is willing to work with other claimants for this kind of undertaking. So confidence building, allowing marine science, possibly fisheries exploration to happen in the South China Sea. A related development, we have also concluded a maritime boundary delimitation in the EEZ, exclusive economic zone, with Indonesia. This is not in the South China Sea. This is in the Sulawesi Sea, in our southern maritime waters border in 2019. But this is very important because this shows that the Philippines is trying to align its position in UNCLOS. Domestically, we've been filing laws to delimit our maritime zones, and at the same time work with our neighbors, with which we also have unresolved maritime disputes with. And with Indonesia, this agreement took 20 years of painstaking negotiations before it bore fruit. And last November, we have also begun working with Indonesia also to have a maritime boundary delimitation agreement, but this time on the continental shelf. So here, I think the point that the Philippines is trying to make is that we're willing to enter into to resolve boundary issues, maritime issues with any neighbor, as long as they would be done in a peaceful way, and of course, not through the use of intimidation or force. We have also been, of course, a very active player in concluding at the soonest possible time a code of conduct on the South China Sea, which we know had stalled already. And of course, the pandemic in the last 2 years made difficult in-person diplomacy that could have made progress, in this important document. So some of the key milestones made in this regard. Of course, the Philippines was the ASEAN-China country coordinator from 2018 until August of last year. And during this stint, this important role, we have made progress in terms of having for the first time a single draft negotiating text and concluding a second reading of this document last year. Of course, the intention, especially of China, China's aspiration is to conclude this document by this year, 2022. Now, of course, other countries have qualms and
Mr. Lucio,
about it.
Mr. Lucio, much obliged if you could conclude. We have one more speaker pending.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So in terms of the security, the Philippines is trying to modernize its defense, including its maritime capacity, trying to diversify its security partners. And of course, this is where the Indian BrahMos missiles comes into the picture. We also had, for the first time, 2+2 talks with Japan, convened just a few days. We have also tried to increase our maritime patrols in the South China Sea and try to recommit to our alliance with the US. Some of the few thoughts, this is my last slide. So economic and security considerations temper Philippine responses to China. Of course, concerns about economic statecraft from China. The emergence of China as a theater for competition between great powers also raised worries about the Philippines getting squeezed between two giants. And of course, security unilaterals like the Quad and AUKUS received mixed responses. Maybe I'll touch on that later. Of course, Philippines is trying to strengthen its alliances with the US, with Japan, Australia, diversify defense and economic partners so that we won't be beholden to just one or a limited pool of partners, but at the same time still engage with China. So as I mentioned earlier, the Philippines will have a new leadership sometime June. We'll have elections in 4 weeks from now. And of course, the results of that very critical elections will have far-reaching implications, not only to Philippine-China relations, but also to Philippine position of the South China Sea, with profound consequences for the region. I'll end there. Sorry it took much time. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lucio. Thank you very much for very eloquent explanation to Philippines' pragmatic approach towards the South China Sea dispute. And thank you very much for a wonderful exposition of providing Philippines' views. So our last speaker, Survi Modgil, and over to you.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Chair. I would like to begin by thanking ICS for giving me this opportunity to be part of panel discussion along with Lucy and Professor Jha, and of course the Chair. As the last speaker of the panel, I'll keep it brief, leaving the scope of an interactive Q&A. Adding to the previous presentations on China's understanding of international law and the long-standing concerns for countries in South China Sea, I would like to bring about an additional aspect to the increasing threat of the larger rules-based order globally by some revisions that China has been doing on its domestic law front. While China's legal warfare is more often than not aimed towards the expansion of its maritime influence in the South China Sea, that effectively increases challenges for international law as well. There has been a reinvigoration in expanding its scope of legal warfare by different branches of the government. It is strategically using its domestic law to put its international maritime claims in context, support the ambiguity about the legality of Chinese claims, and expand the influence of Chinese over the disputed maritime zones. Now, in the past year itself, China has revised 2 different domestic laws to support its maritime claims under international law. The fundamental concern that arises from such steps is the additional uncertainty international rules-based order faces due to the accumulation of ambiguous legal terminologies China uses both in its domestic as well as in its arguments to support to counter international law. Now, an example of the same is a note verbal submitted by China to the UN in 2009 that stated, and I quote, China has indispensable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys right and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and the subsoil thereof. Now, neither adjacent nor relevant waters are mentioned in the international law anywhere. In attempts to support such statements in the international discourse of law, in recent years, China has been reworking on its domestic law. Therefore, it is important to discuss the revised version of the Coast Guard law, which was passed on 22nd Jan 2021 and enacted on 1st Feb 2021. Now, I would like to share my screen to present. Yes, so some of the articles in the new CCG, that is the Chinese Coast Guard law, are Article 2, the Article 2 that states that People's Armed Police Force, Coast Guard, should uniformly enforce duties in the CCG operated waters. Article 3 says that CCG shall conduct law enforcement in waters under the jurisdiction of China. Over here, I would like to mention that in favor of time, please refer to the slides for the entirety of the articles. And I will also be showing a slide by the end of my presentation, which gives links to the Chinese and English language references for the law to be read at length. So moving back to Article 12, that states that CCG shall have the right to take necessary security and control measures to restrain foreign military vessels and foreign vessels used on non-commercial purposes in waters under Chinese jurisdiction. Now, the repeated mention of waters under the jurisdiction of China under UNCLOS, it leads to complete ambiguity as to whether a country is talking about its internal waters, territorial seas, contiguous zones, EEZ, continental shelf, as there are limited provisions that can be exercised in different zones. However, interestingly, in August 2018, the Supreme Court of People had given an interpretation that internal waters, territorial seas, EEZs, continental shelf are all to be ruled by the People's Republic of China. These are all maritime areas under the PRC jurisdiction. Now, the mention of the maritime areas was removed from the final text of the CCG law. However, similar language was used in the draft version of the law. which was stated under the jurisdiction under Article 74 of Item 2, later eliminated from the final law. So the concerns arising from this law are not just the inconsistency it has with regards to international law, but the potential it holds in supporting the Chinese Coast Guard to becoming a dominant force in the region. Considering the growing clashes in these contested maritime zones, the Chinese Coast Guard role as a national tool of escalation or de-escalation is distinguished by its application of force. The scope of international conflict in South China Sea goes beyond naval confrontation, and as we all know what that would lead to. And over the past decades, China itself has implicitly indicated that it does not need to wage a war to achieve its goals. Therefore, it won't be wrong to assume that a more commanding Coast Guard will lead to a more significant presence in the region. With this, I would like to briefly discuss. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. So with this, I would briefly like to discuss the China's maritime traffic law as it all goes in the synchronization of it. The NTSL, which was passed, which was enacted on September 1st, 2021. In this, I would like to talk about Article 30 first, because as Article 30 is, imposes mandatory pilotage requirement for the mentioned vessels on the slide, as you can see. But what is the problem with these impositions? Why is a mandatory pilotage required by Chinese for the maritime safety in the region? It is inconsistent with the international law, as Article 24 of UNCLOS says compulsory pilotage is not required for foreign ships engaged in the innocent passage that do not intend to enter the coastal states' ports or internal waters. Article 44 prohibits the passage through restricted navigation zones established in pursuant to Article 19 of the same law. Now, UNCLOS does allow this, but only when such suspension is essential for the protection of its security, including weapons exercise. The most worrisome of all is perhaps Article 54, which imposes prior notification to these four types of vessels, for four types of ships entering or leaving Chinese territorial sea. This article brings the fundamental principle of international law under question. It restricts the right of innocent passage through territorial seas. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The issues which arise from this law are, of course, of great concern, but nonetheless, if you after studying the law at length, one would see that it is not completely in opposition of UNCLOS or international law. However, the problem with the new law is that it sets ambiguous definitions on the applicability of the law. However, the scope and the loose interpretation of the Chinese vessels mentioned in the law can be dangerous, and the discrepancy it holds with regards to fishing boats as well as coast guard ships of the neighboring nations. The ramifications of such uncertainties are vast. However, it underlines that China intends to use the tactics of slow intensity conflict approach or low intensity coercion, by which China uses incremental steps to expand its de facto control over the disputed territory. Therefore, the Chinese strategy can be said to be a forming of legal overlap over the areas where it claims to normalize its maritime claims in the region. The enforcement of these laws will be difficult, of course, but that may matter less to Beijing in comparison to the slow accumulation of what it sees as the legal underpinning supporting its international maritime claims. These revisions of domestic law can be said to be part of the Chinese lawfare designed to elevate Chinese domestic laws and as a supporting argument to bolster its claims and actions in the region. China imposes the amended maritime law restrictions and regulations on foreign vessels, can strengthen its argument to establish a legal basis to justify physical confrontation on sea, if and when it is to happen. While China's legal warfare is not accompanied by justifications, it does come with military power and economic pressure in the region. Thus, while its effects may not be felt immediately, it needs constant watch by the regional states and the rule-based international community. The scope of such developments is far-reaching and cannot be discussed in isolation from the Chinese grand strategy. Therefore, I would like to conclude by quoting the final day communique of the 5th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee on the Communist Party of China in 2017 that stated, and I quote, "We will carry out Xi Jinping's strong military ideology and the military strategy policy of the new era, and secure the goals of striving for the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the military in 2027, 5 years from now." Well, with this, thank you so much, and I look forward to a Q&A discussion. Thank you so much.
Komodo Singh, you're muted.
Oh, okay, muted. Thank you very much, Surbi, for a wonderful presentation on the Chinese maritime law. And you have rightly flagged out, while the law themselves have largely parallel to many of the countries' law, which enforces maritime security, the problem lies because of the maritime zones itself, unlike many countries in case of China, remains undefined and undefinable. One of the very frequent question to the Chinese expert and delegation has been about on 9-line, that while China expresses its sovereignty over the area contained therein, what kind of maritime zones China considers of the water contained within the 9-line. And thus far, beyond homilies, one doesn't get any very straight answer, even from expert, even from the Chinese. Now, on the compulsory pilotage, you remember this, each of the Chinese law has been drawn on the basis of some of the other countries' law which are there in the progress. Now, even when the ships which are not touching to the coast, Australia passed a compulsory pilotage in Torres Strait. And fundamentally, even when it passed, it went through plenty of opposition, but Australia went through because of the environmental concern of the ship becoming stranded in the Torres Strait. And compulsory pilotage today exists. So taking that precedence, China has a chance to declare a particular area in the South China Sea as a sensitive environmental zone and go ahead and declare compulsory pilotage. Whether people will agree or do not agree, the kind of hullabaloo it will create, that's a different matter. So that being said, I think I will reserve my comments at this stage, and I will invite the question from participant. I already see a hand from Dr. Chakravarti. Sir, go ahead. You are muted. Sir, you are muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute.
Yeah, okay.
I think I finally unmuted. I was muted by the, what you call the ICS itself. Achha, my question is to the lovely speaker I just heard, Surabhi Morgil. She has studied all the laws, and I have served in the South China. She was posted as the defense attaché to Vietnam and was witness to all this happening, and I was located on the shores of the South China Sea. Now the Ukraine war has taken place. China always invents its own laws. It doesn't follow any international law. We heard the Filipino speaker, how they have bent backwards to satisfy them. What do you think are they going to do? Obvious, Russia now has fallen into their lap. Are they going to be more assertive? Do you see a possible offensive on Taiwan? And the laws will be amended as they go on, based on the capabilities of the PLA. Laws are made. And I think by now everybody is clear might is right. Whoever is mighty, he is right. And I think naval might has become extremely important, with China becoming the biggest navy. We've got Admiral Muralidharan also sitting over here, undoubtedly producing 25 ships. I heard the naval chief was surprised, and reducing the time taken to do all this. What is your view now? From this war in Ukraine, how do you see this take a turn? My question is that.
Thank you so much, sir. So as I have mentioned in the presentation itself, that I believe that China's entire aim and agenda over here, while it's in its discussions regarding international law, is that it's developing its domestic law purely and basically to support an argument. It is not that China, I don't believe, is really interested in giving some superior powers to its Coast Guard for any other purposes, except for the fact that it just wants to use the same arguments when it's giving to support its international claims. Now, having said that, I also believe that China is not out there to wage a war, for sure. And I mean, most of us will agree to it. And so therefore, I believe that these smaller steps that China intends to take is actually aimed towards a larger goal of when China believes that it's now the time, now the time has come for it. It has every possible means to its end, every possible means to achieve it. So with regards to the Ukraine war, I don't think that's going to have much of implications in South China Sea, because I don't see China showing its aggression in South China Sea for any other reason which is taking part in another corner of the world. So I don't think the two have any linkages in the sense of China becoming more assertive. Of course, it has a lot of geopolitical concerns revolving around it. But if you're talking about naval assertion in the region because of the Ukraine war, I do not think China in any manner would really intend to do that, because as I mentioned, the Coast Guard, with giving more and more power to its Coast Guard, it intends to strengthen the region and work on its power on the levels of and supporting and enhancing its gray zone area more than anything else. So I don't really think there is any linkages between the two, but I'm sure the other speakers can contribute if they think that other way. Thank you.
So you're muted. Komodo Singh, you're still muted.
Okay. Professor Jha, would you like to add something what Survi said?
Let me add to it. My own perspective is that China's economy is still in doldrums. So it won't like to really be an aggressor, at least for the next 2 years, because there is a lot of backlog which it has to clear with regard to getting back on its feet, particularly in terms of pre-COVID levels. It wants to be a wire media somewhere located between Russia and US, because invariably China needs European and US market desperately. Because if it loses in the next 2 years to other markets or other possible sources which can provide alternatives to China, which is not possible in the short run, but in the long run, I foresee that, particularly countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, which are emerging markets and can provide that kind of substitute products, then China is on a backside, on a back step. Invariably, you also need to look into it that whether, and this is one interesting fact, that whether China can occupy Taiwan, because one of the Taiwanese scholars stated that they don't have landing ship craft. Correct me if I'm wrong, Commander Avar Singh. Because if you want to occupy an island, you need to have a landing craft. Otherwise, you have to really airdrop your soldiers on that island. And they said Taiwanese scholars feel that this is the major vulnerability of Chinese, People's Liberation Navy. I don't think, in terms of primarily from the tactical and operational reasons, I'm not equipped to make a comment, but maybe you can highlight on that. The third issue is that whether China will try to antagonize US at this point of time by taking sides. I think it will play a fence-sitter at this point of time and will not do anything which impinges on its own issues related to sovereignty, be it the case of Xinjiang or Hong Kong. Hong Kong has not died down. It's just the media attention has diverted. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was a related question as well that considering the position of Western world during the Ukraine conflict so far, should we expect similar non-intervention stance from the US in case of China moves to Taiwan? Now, Professor Jha already has touched upon it, and regarding amphibious assault capability of China at this stage, the kind of forces can lift, whether it is possible to overwhelm the defenses of Taiwan to fully capture it. It's a big question. Actually, Ukraine experience of Russia would have led to a serious consideration within the China in the kind of cost of not achieving an operational objective, which can make bear upon a growing great power like China. So that is a issue. Now, whether US will intervene or not intervene, I think largely it's a question will depend upon how much of resistance is the Taiwan going to offer, how much they are willing to stand to themselves. That will decide the nature of assistance or even the scope of intervention. Now, we have a different question is that given the PRC as well as the Taiwanese government have rejected and criticized Philippines versus China UNCLOS arbitration, can we assume that an escalation over 9-dash line can be used to quell the internal conflict between Taiwan and PRC and really rally them towards more consolidated one China policy? Now, it's while it is true that fundamentally some of the maritime claims of Taiwan and China converge in South China Sea, but it will be a simplistic reading of the Taiwan literature to assume that Taiwan echoes the Chinese maritime claim in South China Sea. It comes with the plenty of caveat and qualifications. Taiwan has been expressively concerned about the island territory, which remains in concern, which is in control of Taiwan itself. Beyond that, Taiwan has largely gone with the international narrative of criticizing China's assertive and expansive approach in South China Sea. So whether a escalation over the 9-dash line can rally, at this stage, the kind of political narrative in Taiwan doesn't indicate that kind of convergence. But possibly in future, I don't know, and I will refer back to Survi to add on this issue if she has a view.
I mean, to be very truthful, I think this is something that cannot be predicted. And more than prediction, this is not something that can be assumed to be happening in the near future, as there are multiple areas to be included in this. Whereas it comes to UNCLOS and the Chinese perception of UNCLOS, one needs to know that it is driven internally within China itself. If one refers to a lot of Chinese literature, one would realize that every, be it domestic law or its perception or its counter arguments that are generated within China towards international law are highly driven from the fact that they need to find a Chinese narrative in the law. So I believe until unless that takes place, and I don't think even China itself would want to, completely push forward the entire cause. And in the same, and I believe it's in the process of it is when it's developing its domestic law to support the entire argument. In case of whether this can rally towards, consolidated one China nationalist stance, I'm not really certain about it. I think a lot more needs to be understood in that case, and it cannot just purely be based on some and few similarities that they find on UNCLOS. That will be, as Commodore mentioned, it will be too naive for one to believe that just these issues could lead to.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Survi. And I think we should hear on this subject from Mr. Lucio. And I have a very specific question. While the present government pragmatic approach to the South China Sea dispute, while you can see there, observing from outside has a mixed outcome. Mixed outcome in a sense that while it has maintained a certain kind of maintained a tension level at low level, but the kind of benefit which Philippines had expected to come from it, but not raising this issue stridently, has not come. So do you think that the next government will continue with this pragmatic approach, or will we see certain shifts? And if those shifts are, whether those shifts are in the direction of ameliorating relations with the China, or probably making more strident noises about the China's growing assertiveness in the region? You can touch upon this, and along with any other subject which we have discussed before. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. So before I answer that question, maybe I'll share a couple of points about the Ukraine issue that was raised earlier. Of course, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, the Philippines is very close to those two flashpoints. We are the immediate neighbor to the south of Taiwan. So the cross-strait issue is also a development that we're watching very carefully. And of course, the Ukraine issue, the incursion of Russia, violation of Ukrainian territorial integrity, and raised concerns among countries in Southeast Asia in terms of the possibility that it may embolden countries that may have some historical grievances. Maybe in terms of the alliances, US-led alliances that are maybe to Beijing's view is constraining its rise or bottling it up in its near seas. And of course, the Philippines is part of that network of alliances, hub and spokes, along with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And so it raised some concerns on the part of the Philippines about whether Russia's template may be replicated by China in this Asia-Pacific theater. And of course, at the same time, I think maybe triggered by that developments going on in Ukraine till now, President Duterte in recent weeks have expressed, interest to open Philippine locations upon U.S. request, for access of U.S. Perhaps to respond if in case there will be contingencies either in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. So I think it is an indication of that concern that what's going on in Ukraine may have reverberations beyond Europe. So on the point about how the next Philippine administration may how may it handle relations with China and the arbitration on the South China Sea. So far, the front runner in the elections, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is seen, at least both inside and outside observers, see him as most likely a continuity candidate. So meaning that he will most likely sustain the approach taken by the current administration in fostering friendly relations with China And of course, that raises concern about whether that may disadvantage your Philippine position in the South China Sea. At the same time, I think there is also a recognition about the importance of sustaining and bolstering alliance with the U.S. Duterte in his last few months seemed to have calibrated. Uh, we just recently concluded one of the largest iterations of our annual military exercises with the U.S. Um, so 2 weeks that ended in April 8th, and the day after that, we dispatched our foreign affairs and defense secretary to Tokyo to conclude the 2+2 talks. So I think there's recognition that while we are trying to grow our economic relations with China, of course, we should not be putting all our eggs on one basket. That we also have to have some kind of insurance if in case boldness or assertiveness on the part of Beijing resume. And we need to have countermeasures for that. And doubling down on the alliance and growing our partnerships, including with countries like India through the BrahMos acquisition, I think these are steps in the right direction. And I hope whoever wins next month will sustain this drive.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very vague response. And of course, Philippines, as you said, will continue its diplomatic pragmatism along with strengthening its security to protect its interest. Ambassador Kantha had a question for the panelist, and that's, I think, requires some response from the panelist. Is that, of course, China's claims in the 9-dash lines is vague and ambiguous. But his question it relates to that whether his Chinese historical claims is to complete maritime space, means that features and waters, it encompasses all, or it is limited to only features. So, Professor Jha and Surbhi Modgil, we will invite your response, please.
Now, my studies to this whole issue became very interesting because when I tried to compare, the 1947 China dash lines and then compare it with 2009 Chinese 9-dash lines, there are interesting facts which I came across, because it says that the 1947 map under which the dash 2, which was farther away from Vietnam in comparison to 2009 map, which is 45 nautical miles closer to Vietnam, and the first dash, which starts from the top, is more than 15 nautical miles closer to Vietnam, which means they themselves have shifted 9-dash line closer to Vietnam rather than keeping it away from it. The second aspect, the similar case have been found in the case of dashes, which are closer to Malaysian coast, at the dash 8, which is found closer to the northern part of Philippine Luzon Island. The dash 5, which is closer to Indonesia's island of Pulau Sekatung, has been drawn 15 nautical miles closer than the 1947 map, which means they are giving away certain territories in comparison to 1947 map. Now, this kind of discrepancies have been found in the cases of dash, which are closer to the Philippine island of Palawan and also Malaysia and Brunei coast. These discrepancies are apparent in the Chinese distributed maps of 2009, and in comparison to other maps which the Chinese government have released, there are discerning differences. When China takes an uniform, approach, which says, all those, features and all those things, it talks about adjoining waters, territorial seas, and also contiguous zones related to it. So now, in all, it is not only talking about the territorial seas, it is also talking about contiguous zones related to the territorial sea, which is becoming more comprehensive. And therefore, every country in South China, in Southeast Asia, is crying hoarse that, look, your cow tongue is becoming much more greedy. You are really increasing the dimensions of it. You have technically reduced that area, in comparison to 1947 map, but your area of influence, the catchment area of the cow tongue has increased multifold. Chinese are making this reference that, look, we have resolved the issue with Vietnam, Baby Bay and Tonkin, Gulf of Tonkin, on a bilateral basis. So why can't we do this with other countries on a bilateral basis. And one last thing which I want to say with regard to Taiwan. Taiwan holds one of the biggest islands in South China Sea, which is Itu-Iba Island. And this is a force multiplier if China tries to occupy it, because it means that they will be dominating all features because of the equipment, the military, and all those things which are there, because it has sufficient resources to hold it. I believe if Taiwan will be attacked, Itu-Iba will be the hinting point which will showcase that China is in the mood to it. Because Itu-Iba technically gives Taiwan a kind of a second strike capability. So they will hit it first before hitting Taiwan. So that's my take. Thank you, Ambassador Kanta.
Okay, Survi.
Well, I would like to mention that the 12, when it in UNCLOS, it talks about, one defines its baselines from, 12 nautical miles from, its sea, in its seas. But China has constantly refused to agree with that. And therefore, it is very evident that China intends to include a lot more into it and intends to go way beyond it's the 12 nautical mile procedure available in UNCLOS, and intends to include all possible areas that it deems, fits its understanding of international law. So, of course, sir has explained the historical claim of it, and it is no different in today's day. China continues to use these ambiguous terms to define, what it thinks comes into its territorial seas. So, yeah, thank you.
Following the explanation from the Chinese officials in open briefing to the press or on the international conferences, I'm not an expert, but Chinese officials themselves, despite repeated questions, they also have refrained to clarify. Multiple times they have said that it is not as expansive as it is being made out by other people who are reading our literature. Our claims are limited to the features. That has also been said in Singapore during one of the Shangri-La dialogue people asked that time that why not China declares the geographical coordinates of its dashes. So it makes everybody's clear that what is the extent. Transposing a line drawn on a map from one to another inherently carries certain errors. So some of the examples Professor Jha, which has cited about, when you do not have coordinate and when you use the established references to transfer a position from one map to another, you end up making error. So while China may not have made any error, just have reproduced from one to another, when you are over-interpreting in the lack of coordinates given, you end up measuring it indirectly. So China has not declared the coordinates of 9-dash line, hence ambiguous, that even if it has a maritime, it has claim over the maritime water enclosed within the 9-dash line, people will always have doubt where these lines starts and where they finish. So I think we have well exceeded the time allocated to us by the organizers. And Ambassador Kanta, may I ask you for your brief remarks as a conclusion of this discussion?
I just would like to thank all the panelists, the chair, and the three speakers for excellent discussions we had today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you, my three speakers, for making a very wonderful and educative presentation to all of us. And thank you, all the participants who have been listening to us on this issue. Should you have any further question on this issue, I think we should continue to engage and with each other on email, phone calls, because this is the issue which will continue to bother us for times to come. Thank you very much. It has been wonderful to participate in this discussion. And thank you, Survi, for inviting me for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of ICS, let me thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their thoughts on the subject with our audience. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. Join us next week for our annual Vikidat Memorial Lecture by Professor Hans van de Ven, Professor of Modern Chinese History at Cambridge University. He will be speaking on the topics Japan's surrender in 1945 and the remaking of East Asia. Thank you, everyone, for logging in today. Have a good evening.